You know, usually when we look at a familiar piece of poetry, there's this expectation of, well, soft, fuzzy sentimentality.
Right, like something you'd see on a greeting card.
Yeah, a greeting card you pick up at the pharmacy, you read a nice little poem, it makes you feel warm inside, and you just point at it and say, oh, that is lovely.
Comforting, subjective, and, safe.
Safe. We like things to be gentle, to be easily digestible, and to fit neatly into a picture frame on our wall.
But today, we're tearing up that greeting card.
We really are. We have a massive stack of notes, historical treatises, and commentaries sitting on the desk right now, and we are going to see what David was actually saying in Psalm 23.
And spoiler alert, it is a gritty survival song, not a lullaby.
Welcome back to another deep dive. Look at your life right now, you listening. Are you steering the ship yourself? Because if you are, you might want to pay close attention today.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our goal is a rigorous, word-by-word look at these famous 6 verses.
We want to uncover the specific historical setting, the literary structure, and the concrete theological truths that anchor the soul.
Right, and we're pulling from scholars like Charles Spurgeon, John Calvin, and a whole host of ancient and modern exegetes to see what is really happening beneath the English translation.
And that requires us to, change our posture as readers.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, we have to strip away the modern sentimentality and look at the raw, awe-inspiring authority of the sovereign God presented in the text.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this entire discussion must be framed around the absolute sufficiency of God.
Which is huge.
It is. This ancient poem is not a promise of a pain-free life.
No, not at all.
It's a stunning declaration of a God who is entirely adequate for his people in every possible condition.
You step into the world of ancient Near Eastern survival, of wild predators and absolute divine authority, and suddenly that sentimental picture frame shatters.
It totally shatters. We're looking at a textual landscape that is rugged and dangerous.
It's a theological battlefield, really, where the stakes are life and death, and where comforts are forged in the fires of actual physical peril.
Spot on.
I want to get straight into the historical context. When most people think of Psalm 23, they picture a young, ruddy David.
Like a teenager.
Yeah, a teenager sitting on a grassy hillside in Bethlehem, plucking a harp while a few sheep graze nearby. The sun is shining, the breeze is blowing.
It's a nice image, but it's not the reality of the text.
Right. The sources point out that while David was indeed a shepherd boy in his youth, the mature reflections in this text point to a much later date in his life.
A much darker date.
Yeah. The most historically sound setting derived from our sources is actually 2 Samuel chapters 15 through 17.
And that context completely alters how you read the psalm. At that point in his life, David is not a boy.
Right.
He is an older man, a seasoned warrior, and the reigning monarch of Israel. But he is fleeing for his life.
From his own son.
Yes. His son Absalom has launched a treasonous rebellion. David has been betrayed by his closest counselors.
Specifically Ahithophel, right?
Yeah, Ahithophel, whose advice was considered as highly as the oracle of God. And now David is driven out of Jerusalem.
The historical account says he is weeping as he climbs the Mount of Olives barefoot, with his head covered in mourning.
He is forced into the barren, hostile wilderness of Mahanaim. He is stripped of his royal comforts, surrounded by loyal but desperate men, and entirely vulnerable.
Think about the physical reality of that moment. He's leaving the fortified walls of Jerusalem.
Leaving his throne.
Leaving his throne, the Ark of the Covenant, the established place of worship. He is crossing the Kidron Valley, heading into the Judean wilderness, which is essentially a barren wasteland of limestone and dust.
This is a man who knows what it means to be hunted.
And in that specific context of being a king driven into the wilderness, we have to look at the cultural backdrop of the ancient Near East to really get what David is saying.
Right, because in the surrounding pagan nations, you had these massive despotic rulers.
Think of Hammurabi of Babylon or the ruthless Assyrian kings. They aggressively claimed the title of shepherd for themselves.
It was royal propaganda, plain and simple, to assert absolute control and authority over their subjects.
That is a crucial historical detail. The pagan kings used the shepherd motif to communicate absolute, terrifying ownership.
When an Assyrian king called himself a shepherd, he was telling his people, I own you, I rule you. You are my flock to fleece, to consume, and to slaughter for my own purposes.
Wow.
The title was designed to strike fear into the hearts of the populace. The shepherd's staff, in the hands of a human despot, was an instrument of oppression.
But what David does here is a radical subversion of that cultural norm.
It really is.
I love how David handles this. David is the greatest king of Israel. He has conquered armies, expanded borders, and accumulated massive wealth.
He has the military might to crush opposition.
Yet he deliberately abdicates the title of shepherd. He humbles himself. He takes the position of a helpless, wandering, vulnerable sheep, and he assigns the title of shepherd exclusively to Yahweh.
He's basically telling his people, I might be the king to you, but to God, I am just a sheep in desperate need of leading.
It's a stunning admission of total inability.
David recognizes that without the sovereign God, he has no direction, no defense, and no sustenance.
He strips himself of all royal pretense.
And that brings us to the literary context. We have to look at where Psalm 23 sits in the broader collection of the Psalms.
Right, it's placed in Book 1 of the Psalter.
Quoting insights derived from the legendary preacher Charles Spurgeon, we see a brilliant, intentional sequence in Psalms 22, 23, and 24.
They form a Christological triptych.
Let's break that down for a second. A triptych.
I think of those massive hinged paintings you see in old cathedrals or museums.
Yeah, exactly.
You have a central panel that is the main focus, but it's physically held up by the hinges, connecting it to a left panel and a right panel.
You cannot fully understand the middle picture unless you read the story across all three pieces of wood.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. Psalm 22 is the left panel, the Psalm of the Cross.
It begins with the agonizing cry, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?"
It gives us the graphic, prophetic picture of the Good Shepherd dying in agony for the sheep, bearing the wrath of God to secure their salvation.
Then you cross over into the center panel, Psalm 23. This represents the present dispensation.
This is the great shepherd currently caring for, guiding, and preserving his flock in the present day.
You only get to enjoy the green pastures of the center panel because the bloody sacrifice was paid in the left panel.
And then the right panel, Psalm 24, looks to the future. It announces the chief shepherd returning as the King of glory, strong and mighty in battle, demanding the ancient doors be lifted up so he can enter with his redeemed people.
So you cannot get to the green pastures without passing through the sacrifice.
Right.
And you cannot sit in the green pastures forever without eventually looking forward to the King of glory returning. That completely frames the way we read this text.
Furthermore, we must note the specific literary genre of Psalm 23. It's classified as a psalm of trust and confidence.
This is distinct from the lament psalms that David so frequently wrote. In a lament psalm, you typically find desperate pleas for rescue or agonizing questions asking, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me?"
But there are no such questions here.
None. There are no petitions. David never once asks God to do something in this psalm.
It is a continuous, uninterrupted declaration of absolute fact. David does not ask God to become his shepherd. He states it as a concrete reality.
Which means we are dealing with statements of objective truth, not fluctuating human emotion.
So, looking at the layout of the text, David gives us a distinct progression. We move from the shepherd in the pastures in verses 1 through 3, into the companion in the valley in verse 4, and we finish with the host at the banquet in verses 5 and 6.
It mirrors a physical pilgrimage. You start in the field, you walk through the terrifying ravine, and you end up in the palace.
Let's start unpacking those first 3 verses. David makes this opening declaration. Yahweh Roi, the Lord is my shepherd.
I want to highlight the personal pronoun my here. David does not just say God is a shepherd to the nation of Israel, though that is corporately true.
He claims a highly individualized covenant intimacy with the sovereign God.
That pronoun changes everything. It is the language of faith appropriating the promises of God. The name used is Yahweh, the covenant-keeping, self-existent God, who revealed himself to Moses at the burning bush.
This is the great I am.
So David is bringing the infinite, holy creator of the cosmos down into the dirt and the dust of his own daily existence.
He is saying the God who holds the galaxies together is the same God who is meticulously managing the details of my life.
Because Yahweh is his shepherd, David concludes, I shall not want. Now, we need to spend some time unpacking that phrase because it is frequently misunderstood in modern contexts.
It does not mean the sheep will never experience physical hunger or grief or exhaustion.
Right, because later in the psalm, he is literally walking through a valley of the shadow of death. So, I shall not want cannot mean I will get a life of total luxury and zero problems.
If that were true, the rest of the psalm would make no sense.
Precisely. The Hebrew concept here means the sheep lacks no good thing that divine wisdom ordains. The sheep is entirely dependent, and the shepherd is entirely sufficient.
It means that whatever the shepherd determines is necessary for the ultimate eternal good of the sheep, the shepherd will provide.
If the shepherd withholds something, it is because the sheep does not actually need it for its true spiritual well-being. Sometimes the shepherd provides lack, because the lack is what the sheep needs to stop wandering.
That is a tough pill to swallow. We want the shepherd to give us everything we demand, right when we demand it.
But David moves into verse 2, expanding on how the shepherd actually works. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters.
I always look at the verbs here. He makes me and he leads me. I think about this like a parent who knows a toddler desperately needs a nap, even when the toddler is fiercely resisting.
The toddler wants to keep running around, getting more and more exhausted, cranky, and prone to injury.
The parent has to step in, pick the child up, put them in the crib, and enforce the rest. A sheep does not find the green grass on its own.
Left to itself, a sheep would wander off a cliff or eat poisonous weeds. The shepherd has to initiate the resting.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize the dynamic. The sheep is devoid of intrinsic direction. The verbs emphasize divine initiative.
And look at the waters mentioned in the Hebrew text, Mei Menusho. This translates literally to waters of resting places.
These are not rushing, boisterous mountain rapids.
But a sheep is terrified of rushing water. If a sheep falls into a fast-moving river, its heavy wool acts like a sponge. It will soak up the water, pull the animal under, and drown it in a matter of seconds.
Nor are these stagnant, diseased pools where parasites breed. The shepherd carefully selects quiet, clean waters designed specifically for life and safe refreshment.
The shepherd scouts the terrain ahead of time to find the exact flow of water the sheep can handle.
It is a tailored provision. He knows exactly what the sheep can handle. He knows the weight of the wool.
Then in verse 3, David says, "He restores my soul." The literal idea is bringing the soul back.
When the sheep is exhausted, depleted, or has wandered off, the shepherd brings it back and gives it new life. There is a shepherding concept I read about in the sources called a cast-down sheep.
Ah, yes.
A sheep can wander into a little depression in the ground, roll over on its back, and because its legs are short and its body is heavy, it literally cannot roll back over.
It will lie there on its back with its legs in the air, panicking.
Gases build up in its stomach, blood circulation stops in its extremities, and within a few hours or days it will die. Predators can just walk right up to it. The sheep cannot save itself.
The shepherd has to count the flock, realize one is missing, go find it, gently roll it over, rub its legs to get the blood flowing again, and physically stand it up. That is what "he restores my soul" looks like in the dirt.
That illustration hits the mark perfectly.
Yeah.
Restoration is not just an emotional pick-me-up. It is a rescue from imminent death caused by the sheep's own foolishness.
And following that physical and spiritual restoration, the text says, "He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness."
The Hebrew phrase is majlei sidek. The shepherd directs the sheep along straight, moral, objective paths.
He does not restore the soul so the sheep can go back to wandering in dangerous places or flipping over in a ditch again. He restores it for obedience.
The paths of righteousness are specific. They are not subjective feelings or vague impulses. They are the objective standards of God's revealed will.
And then David hits us with the reason for all of this. We have to highlight the most crucial phrase in this entire section. For his name's sake, or in Hebrew, Laman Shimo.
Why does God do all this? Why does he provide the grass, enforce the rest, find the quiet water, rescue the cast-down sheep, and guide it on the right path?
The text answers explicitly. For his own name's sake. God's salvation and guidance are radically God-centered.
He acts to vindicate his own holy glory and his covenant character. He is faithful to the sheep because he is faithful to himself.
He cannot deny his own nature. In the ancient world, if a shepherd lost his sheep, it ruined his reputation. His name would be disgraced in the community.
Yahweh stakes his own eternal reputation on the successful guidance and preservation of his flock.
He saves us and leads us so that the entire universe can look at his work and praise his magnificent grace.
So it is not about the sheep being particularly impressive, smart, or worthy. It is entirely about the shepherd's honor. I think about singing this as an ancient Israelite. Imagine standing in the congregation, maybe after your crops just failed, or you heard rumors of the Assyrian army marching toward your city. How would this land with that original target audience?
It was intended to thoroughly humble them. To call Yahweh a shepherd is to admit that they are helpless, foolish sheep who cannot save themselves.
It stripped the Israelites of their autonomy.
It taught them to rely exclusively on God's covenant character rather than their visible circumstances. If you think you can guide your own life, you cannot sing Psalm 23 honestly.
You have to take the posture of absolute dependency. It forced the original audience to look past the drought, past the invading armies, and fix their eyes on the character of the God who staked his name on their survival.
Look at your own life right now, you listening. Are you looking to your own strength, your own bank account, your own cleverness to steer your career or your family? Or are you resting in the shepherd?
Because if you are the captain of your own soul, you are heading for a shipwreck. A sheep that decides it knows better than the shepherd is a dead sheep.
And we must apply this text by directly confronting modern theological errors, particularly the prosperity gospel.
That system falsely equates God's favor with earthly luxury, physical health, and financial wealth.
It reads, "I shall not want," as a blank check for materialism. But true contentment is realizing that having the shepherd is enough, even if the pasture is sparse for a season.
Furthermore, this text calls modern believers to rely on the ordinary means of grace reading scripture, gathering with the local church, and prayer to have their souls restored.
We must reject the modern urge to chase subjective mystical experiences or continuous emotional highs. The shepherd leads through objective paths of righteousness, anchored in his revealed truth.
The ordinary means of grace. It is so easy to want fireworks, to want a burning bush moment every Tuesday. But the shepherd usually leads us to quiet waters and straight paths. It is steady, daily, unglamorous obedience.
Okay, let us move out of the pasture. Here's where it gets really interesting.
I want to point out a grammatical shift in the text as we hit verse 4. Through verses 1, 2, and 3, David is talking about God in the third person. He leads me, he restores, he makes me. God is spoken of as a subject.
But suddenly, as the shadows lengthen in verse 4, David stops talking about God and starts talking directly to God in the second person. For you are with me.
That grammatical pivot is the hinge of the entire psalm. When the scenery gets dark, the theology becomes intensely intimate.
The third-person description is sufficient for the sunny pasture, but you need a second-person communion for the dark ravine. Let us analyze the valley itself.
The Hebrew word is salmaveth. It is a compound word describing pitch-black darkness, the deepest, most severe gloom imaginable.
In the geography of ancient Israel, this refers to a deep, claustrophobic ravine, overhung by high precipitous cliffs. Think of the Wadi Kelt, a massive gorge in the Judean desert.
These wadis were treacherous. In the dry season, they provided a route through the rugged hills, but flash floods could wipe you out without warning.
Predators like lions and Syrian bears hid in the caves lining the ravine walls. Robbers used the high ground to ambush travelers. It was a place calculated to inspire absolute dread. The sun would be entirely blocked out by the canyon walls.
Wait, hold on. If this shepherd is supposed to be perfectly leading the sheep on paths of righteousness, as verse 3 just told us, how do they end up in a pitch-black valley of death in verse 4?
Did the shepherd screw up? Did he take a wrong turn?
Did the sheep wander off the path, and now God has to mount a rescue mission?
This raises an important question, and the biblical answer is striking. The valley is part of the righteous path.
The shepherd intentionally leads the sheep through the darkness. The valley is not a mistake. It is not an accident of providence.
It is a geographic necessity to get to higher, greener pastures. During the summer months, shepherds in the Middle East have to move their flocks from the dry lowlands up into the mountains where the snows have melted and fresh grass is growing.
The only way up the mountain is through the dark valleys. The sheep does not fear evil, not because the evil is absent, but because the shepherd is present.
The danger is real. The predators are real. The steep drop-offs are real. But the presence of the shepherd supersedes the reality of the threat.
For you are with me. That is the anchor. He doesn't say, I fear no evil because I have a positive attitude, or I fear no evil because the valley isn't actually that dangerous.
The valley is lethal. The comfort comes entirely from the companion.
And then David mentions the specific tools the shepherd carries. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Let us break the mechanics of those tools down, because this is where the ancient context shines.
You have the rod, the shibboleth. This was not a walking stick, it was a weapon.
Shepherds would find the root of an oak tree or a sapling, carve it down so there was a heavy bulbous knob at the end, and then they would hammer heavy bits of iron into that knob.
It was a heavy club designed for close quarters combat with wolves, lions, and bears. They would practice throwing it with lethal accuracy.
And then you have the Mishnah, which was the long staff. This is what we typically picture, a long piece of wood, often with a crook at the end.
It was used to gently hook the leg or the chest of a wandering sheep, to pull it back from a cliff edge without breaking its bones. The shepherd would also lean heavily on it during long days of standing watch.
So you have a club designed to crush the skull of a predator, and a long staff designed to hook a wandering sheep. And David says both of these things comfort him.
Those two instruments represent severe discipline and tender protection. The sheep finds comfort in the sheer, unyielding authority of the Almighty.
The club tells the sheep that the shepherd is a warrior who can crush any threat that approaches the flock.
The staff tells the sheep that the shepherd is vigilant and will physically catch them if they slip toward disaster.
The comfort does not come from a soft, gentle pat on the head. It comes from knowing the shepherd is armed, dangerous to enemies, and fiercely devoted to defending his flock.
If a wolf approaches, the shepherd does not negotiate. He uses the iron-tipped rod.
I am trying to imagine singing this as an ancient Israelite who just got conscripted into the army or someone facing famine. How on earth would this land with them?
This verse was meant to cultivate fearless trust during times of extreme, tangible danger. Think about their history. Continuous war with the Philistines, the threat of exile, national crises, famine.
It taught them that God's presence is most intensely felt when danger is closest.
They needed a theology that held up not just in peacetime during the harvest festivals, but when the Assyrian siege ramps were built against their walls, or when they were wandering in the desert without water.
It gave them a vocabulary to express fear while simultaneously declaring victory over that fear because of Yahweh's presence.
You, listening to this right now, have your own dark valleys. It might be a terrifying medical diagnosis you just received.
It might be sudden job loss, a betrayal that shattered your family, deep isolation, or the agonizing loss of someone you love.
The valley of the shadow of death is a very real piece of geography in the human experience. We all have to walk through it.
We must apply this text by assuring believers that suffering is an expected part of the Christian life. The modern prosperity gospel fails completely here because it has no theology of suffering.
God does not promise a helicopter ride over the valley.
Yeah.
He promises his presence walking next to you on the valley floor.
I want to draw on an analogy from our Puritan sources regarding the shadow of death. As one writer noted, the shadow of a dog cannot bite you, and the shadow of a sword cannot kill you.
That is a phenomenal image. The shadow might look terrifying as it stretches across the canyon wall, but a shadow has no teeth. A shadow cannot draw blood.
Correct. Because of the cross, which we will discuss shortly, the actual eternal sting of death has been completely removed for the believer.
What passes over us in this life is merely the shadow. It might bring temporary grief, but it cannot sever us from God.
Therefore, believers are called to trust God's objective word in the darkness, rather than relying on shifting human emotions.
Your feelings will tell you that you are abandoned in the valley. The objective truth of God's word says, I will never leave you nor forsake you.
You must let the rod and the staff comfort you when your emotions are in full panic mode.
Let the authority of God calm your panic. Stop looking at the shadows and look at the iron-tipped club in the hands of the shepherd.
So if the valley is this place of fierce, intimate protection, what happens when you finally emerge from it? David completely flips the script on us in verses 5 and 6.
We go from a dusty, terrifying wadi straight into a royal palace. We are looking at the host at the banquet.
David says, Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. The transition is jarring if you don't grasp the culture.
It is a massive metaphorical shift. We are no longer out in the rugged wilderness with a shepherd and sheep.
We have suddenly been transported into a tent or a palace with the sovereign king hosting a magnificent feast.
This invokes the ancient, sacred Bedouin custom of hospitality. In the ancient Near East, when a host invited a guest into his tent, the host assumed full, absolute responsibility for that guest's safety.
The law of the tent dictated that the host would defend the guest with his own life. To allow a guest to be harmed while under your roof was the ultimate, unforgivable disgrace.
It would ruin your family name forever.
So when David says this table is prepared in the presence of his enemies, it means the enemies are standing right there. The people who hunted him, the people who slandered him, maybe even Absalom's army.
They are at the edge of the camp watching him eat. But they are completely paralyzed. They cannot touch him. They cannot fire an arrow. They cannot draw a sword because the host of the tent is too mighty.
If they attack the guest, they are declaring war on the host.
Exactly. The enemies are reduced to helpless spectators of God's grace. They are forced to watch Yahweh lavish favor upon his servant.
And notice what the host does. David continues, Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over.
The oil was a customary mark of honor. When a distinguished guest arrived after traveling through the hot, dusty desert, the host would pour fragrant olive oil mixed with spices on their head.
It would soothe the sun-baked skin, provide a pleasant aroma, and culturally signal that the guest was highly favored.
It is absolute luxury after the brutality of the valley and the cup running over. The host is pouring the wine, and he doesn't just fill it to the brim and stop. He keeps pouring.
The wine spills over the edge, runs down the sides of the cup, and pools on the table. It is a visual demonstration that the host has unlimited resources.
He is not rationing his supplies. It points out the sheer abundance, the staggering generosity of God's grace.
God does not just give enough for bare survival. He gives an excess of blessing.
The overflowing cup is a direct affront to a scarcity mindset. And then we hit verse 6, the grand finale of the psalm. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life.
We have to look at the Hebrew here because the English translation is far too passive. It does not carry the full weight of what David is declaring.
Yes, the words in English sound like two gentle attendants walking a few paces behind you. Let us look at the reality.
The Hebrew word translated as mercy is hesed. This is arguably the most critical theological word in the Old Testament.
It denotes unfailing covenant loyalty, steadfast love, the loyal grace that God binds himself to by oath.
It is a love that cannot be broken because it is based on God's promise, not human performance.
And the word translated as follow is redaf. In almost every other context in the Old Testament, redaf is a military term.
It describes an army hunting down a fleeing enemy. It means to aggressively pursue, to hunt, or to chase down with relentless intent.
So it is not like goodness and mercy are just casually strolling along behind David like a shadow. Goodness and his are hunting him.
I like to picture them as twin sheepdogs. They are relentlessly tracking the believer every single day of their life. They are aggressive.
They are barking at the heels of the sheep, guarding the flanks, biting at predators, ensuring the sheep never falls away from the flock.
If the sheep tries to wander off, the sheepdogs chase it down and herd it back to the shepherd. They are the active enforcers of God's grace.
That is a highly accurate picture of the Hebrew syntax. It is the active, relentless pursuit of God's grace. The believer is pursued by divine love.
And then we reach the final clause, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
The Hebrew construction here is vishapti. This translates to, I shall return and dwell.
After all the wandering, after the green pastures, the dark valleys, and the enemies at the border, the ultimate destination is permanently secured.
It is the promise of eternal communion in the sanctuary of God.
I think about how this would hit the ancient Israelites. They spent so much time wandering, so much time fighting for a small strip of land. What did this conclusion do to them?
It cultivated a deep, aching longing for the sanctuary and the presence of God. It taught them to prioritize communion with Yahweh over mere physical safety.
The ultimate goal of the believer is not just to be fed in the pasture and not just to survive the valley, but to live in a physical presence of the host.
The house of the Lord was the epicenter of their joy. It redirected their hope from temporary earthly peace to eternal divine fellowship.
Applying this to us today, consider the absolute security you have if you belong to this host. If you are seated at his table under his roof, no enemy in the spiritual or physical realm can touch your soul.
You are guarded by the law of divine hospitality.
The theological application here centers on the perseverance of the saints. The believer is kept by the active force of God's grace, not by their own human effort.
Those twin sheepdogs of heast and goodness will not fail in their mission. They will successfully hunt you down and keep you in the fold.
Furthermore, we must look at the prepared table. This points out that grace is a finished, completed work.
It completely rejects works-based theological systems that attempt to continually re-sacrifice Christ or add human merit to salvation.
You do not go into the kitchen and cook the meal alongside God. You are invited to sit down, rest, and eat what the sovereign host has already perfectly prepared.
So what does this all mean? We've spent all this time in the Old Testament dissecting Hebrew words, talking about sheepdogs, iron clubs, and ancient Bedouin tents.
How does this ancient Hebrew poem intersect with the New Testament? We have to bring this entire theological framework to its ultimate conclusion. Let us look at the Christological fulfillment.
What's fascinating here is how explicitly the New Testament authors and Jesus himself claim this exact psalm.
We turn to John chapter 10, verse 11. Jesus stands before the religious leaders and makes a massive declaration, I am the good shepherd.
By claiming this specific title, Jesus is not just using a pleasant agrarian metaphor to say he is a nice guy. He is identifying himself as Yahweh incarnate.
He is saying, I am the God of Psalm 23, the one David wrote about, standing right in front of you in human flesh.
He is claiming the divine covenant name. He is the shepherd who was promised. Let us lay out the complete Christological picture, this threefold shepherd concept we hinted at earlier with the triptych.
The New Testament gives us three distinct titles for Christ as shepherd, mapping perfectly to the Psalms we discussed. First, he is the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep.
This fulfills Psalm 22 through his substitutionary atonement on the cross. He pays the penalty for the wandering sheep.
Second, he is the great shepherd, as stated in Hebrews 13. The writer of Hebrews says, God brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep.
He rose from the dead to intercede, rule, and guide his flock today through his sufficient completed word. This correlates to the present realities of Psalm 23.
Third, he is the chief shepherd, as Peter calls him in 1 Peter chapter 5. Peter says, when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory.
He will appear in the clouds to gather his flock into eternal glory, which correlates to the victorious king of Psalm 24.
That is a staggering progression. Good, great, and chief. The cross, the present care, and the crown.
And I want to tie this back to the valley of the shadow of death. At Calvary, Jesus entered the ultimate valley.
He didn't just experience the shadow, he took the actual substance of death. He took the full, unmitigated wrath of God.
He experienced the darkness of physical death and spiritual separation, crying out that he was forsaken, so that his sheep could walk through their earthly valleys without ever facing divine condemnation.
He took the brutal bite of death, leaving only the harmless shadow for us.
It is a stunning, beautiful exchange. And Christ fulfills the table imagery as well. He acts as the ultimate host.
He refers to himself as the bread of life. He institutes the new covenant at a table, taking the cup and saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood.
By doing this, he secures a permanent place in the Father's house for all who trust in him. He promised his disciples in John 14, in my Father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you.
The banquet of Psalm 23 directly anticipates the marriage supper of the Lamb in Revelation chapter 19. The overflowing cup is the blood of the eternal covenant.
That brings everything full circle, from the Old Testament pasture, through the blood of the cross, all the way to the eternal kingdom in Revelation.
Before we sign off, here is something to chew on that we haven't talked about yet. Think about the history of the Christian church.
Think about the French Huguenots, or the Scottish Covenanters, or the early church martyrs in the Roman Colosseum.
When they were being marched to the stake or standing before lions, history records that they frequently sang Psalm 23.
They did not sing it as a funeral dirge. They sang it as a battle cry.
They were looking at their executioners, their literal enemies, and singing about a prepared table.
They were looking at the flames and singing about the valley, the shadow of death, having no actual teeth.
They understood that the iron-tipped rod of the shepherd was more real than the executioner's sword. The next time you read this psalm, read it with that kind of defiance.
You know, at the beginning, we talked about tearing up that soft, sentimental greeting card. What you find underneath the sentiment is so much better.
You find a sovereign God who acts as a fierce protector, a generous host, and a relentless pursuer of your soul. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Rest securely in the sovereign shepherd today.